All right. Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our men's group study in the Church Dogmatics by Karl Barth. We're looking at section 4, the doctrine of reconciliation, and we are considering study volume 25, which has followed the exaltation of the Son of Man, in volume 24. We've been looking at the man of sin, or sloth, as Barth says, and that is in paragraph 65. And we're going to look at the concluding lesson on the man of sin. We will conclude paragraph 65 this time, so that the next lesson will actually pick up the doctrine of sanctification. We'll transition from man prior to justification to moving on to the actual doctrine of sanctification. So we'll finish up the man of sin today. We're going to take a look at pages 80 to 120. I think it's actually 80 to 118, but we'll call it 80 to 120. We'll round it off. That will finish section 65 completely, and it's going to end up giving us a picture of the state of man prior to justification and the state of man as being in need of sanctification. We'll have that picture before we get into paragraph 66. So it'll give us an actual image of this state of man. We'll begin by taking a look at block 1. Okay, if you look at block 1, we're going to take a look at the sin of the prideful human care. And human care equals the autonomous form of sloth. It's one's refusal to accept the limitation of finitude. Self becomes aligned with chaos and suffers a self-manufactured anxiety. One lives in the unrest of rejecting one's limit of finitude. And so human care evolves to becoming a position of anxiety and a position of a desire for assurances and for security. There's a tragic persistence which results in an entrapment in this particular position. Man becomes enslaved to the bondage of a need for security. So it's a bondage in a way. It's a bondage of anxiety over this need for security. And it becomes a fantasy object for the self, which oppresses the self and is destructive. And that destructive fantasy object is the individual who imagines an end in death without God, imagining an end in death outside the covenant. And this anxiety actually causes this fantasy to become infectious and to actually propagate itself. So anxiety feeds a vicious circle, a self-perpetuating vicious circle of anxiety and dread over this feeling that we will die outside of covenant, we will die away from God, and it creates this anguish, this misery, and this destructive object begins to self-propagate and to entrap the man into a vicious, destructive circle. But Barth has already taught us again and again the doctrine of reconciliation and the sovereignty of God with regard to his election through Christ. So we're going to take a look at block 2. We're going to take a look at this transcendent will of God that can heal and bring peace to the man of anxiety, the man of human care. So if you take a look at block 2, we're going to look at the transcendence of the will of God over the sin of human care. Man's false object of death outside of covenant is transcended by the divine objective truth of election, of covenant, and of atonement. Remember, Barth has already taught us the atonement is historical, objective, complete. Historical, objective, and complete. That is the objective truth, which is the transcendence to defeat this false object of dread. Therefore, the objective truth and direction in the Christ event negates every incarnation of human care and its concealment, which shows up primarily in 2 ways, said Barth. It shows up in achievement. Some conceal this anxiety under the high concept of conscientious work. Man is driven by success and by the need for achievement, a seeking of one's own glory as a kind of a finite eternity. But it can be hidden in resignation. Some conceal this anxiety under the falsity of a resignation and contemplation as an antithetical stand against those driven to achievement, but contemplation becomes capable of creating a hierarchy of achievement of its own, so it can become very similar to achievement. So Barth tells us in note 3, sin as human care also results in a threefold relational consequences with regard to being before God. God's self-revelation is given at the frontier of man's limit of finitude, and human care turns away exactly at this precise point, this frontier. With regard to humanity and human fellowship, in human care the self isolates himself from others. In human care, the very best that can be hoped for is a rivalry of cares between selves. And then with regard to the holistic unity of body and soul, which Barth has already taught us, the soul takes flight into idol-like fantasy regions, and the body descends into self-assertion impulses and renunciation. The unity between body and soul becomes fragmented. There's a disintegration of the self. And so it becomes very destructive. There becomes a very much an incarnate type of self-destruction and dissolution and fragmentation of the self. So that takes us to our 3rd block and our final moment of really defining the misery of man. That is basically the concept under which this is all abbreviated. It's abbreviated under the concept of misery. It is the man of misery who needs liberation and reconciliation and deliverance through sanctification. So if we look at block 3, we're going to take a look at the anthropos talaporos, and that is the misery of man in need of sanctification. There are 4 basic aspects of misery. The misery of man equals man is exiled unto the far country of sin. It's the fruition of sloth. Misery is magnified because man is not released from the sphere of God's sovereign influence, but man ends up existing in a perversion of human creatureliness because he does not appropriate this sovereign grace. The 3 aspects of misery, when reflected off Christology and Christ's light of hope, take on these 3 aspects. And number 1 is misery as a life of sarx. In the humiliation, Christ took up our misery into himself. Misery is a mortal sickness unto death, but Christ frees us from our boundless misery. In the Scriptures, this is described as living according to the sarx, flesh. And under the concept of sarx, man is victimized by pathora as the dissolution of the self, that disintegration of the self. Man under the enslavement of this life according to the flesh, this life of disintegration, means to be trapped in a fatal history of mankind. History becomes fatalistic. Now, second, there's the aspect of misery as a life of talaporos. The talaporos is the Greek word for misery. It's the actual Greek word for misery. And in the exaltation of Christ, we have been liberated from the old man of misery to become true man. But our refusal of this liberation results in being exiled to the endless cycle of dissolution and the endless cycle of disintegration. The cycle ends up passing through original sin to actual sins to propagating sins in action that take on a autonomy of their own. And this ends up resulting in an actualized, detailed, and distorted fatalistic history, says Barth. Third aspect of misery is life of thelese doulia, and thelese doulia means the bondage of the will, where man's will is enslaved to sin. Through the exaltation of Christ, we've been liberated for a concept of freedom, but that is a filled-out freedom that is filled out with meaning as a restored fellowship with God. We remain in the bondage of will when we refuse the new possibilities that correspond to Christ that he has opened up in his humiliation and exaltation. And so from all of these teachings, we've got one final block to look at, and it's going to give us the picture. And Barth wants to bring us to this point because he wants to give us a picture to take hold of, because we're going to discuss sanctification next. So take a look at 3b. We're going to look at the triad for the prior state of man who is in need of sanctification. That is the man of the sark's flesh, who has been victimized by the disintegration of the self, the fragmentation of self. It's the old man of talaporos, and that is misery, of being entrapped in that cycle of sin that we talked about, that cycle of sin. From original sin to actual sins to the propagating autonomy of sins in action, and then that living in misery and living according to the flesh results in an entrapment of will, a will that is in bondage to sin, a thelese doulia, and that's our triad. And Barth tells us that this triad is exemplified in Romans 7:24, where it actually uses that Greek concept of talaporos. The Greek concept is actually in Romans 7:24. But instead of misery, it says wretched in English. What a wretched man I am, who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Who will bring me justification? Who will bring me sanctification? The answer is that God's election will bring man justification through Jesus Christ, sanctification through the power of the Spirit as the Spirit of truth, as Christ tells us in the Gospel of John, and the Spirit of truth as issuing from the Lordship of Jesus Christ will create sanctification within us, within the kingdom of God. So the answer is the Christ event. Who will rescue me? It is Christ as the sovereign grace from the Father and the Son. That wraps up a very powerful lesson that concludes paragraph 65. We basically got a chance to take a look at the final picture of this man of pride, or the man of sin, or the man of sloth. He gives those three different terms, but basically it is living according to the flesh, living according to sarx, living in wretchedness or talaporos, misery, because our will is doulia, enslaved to hamartia, sin. Our thelese will is douleia, enslaved to hamartia sin. That's our condition. Who will rescue us? That answer is Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Christos Messiah, the Kyrios, Lord, the Krinos, Judge, the Christ who has been exalted as Son of Man to the right hand of the Father into the Uranos, realm of dominion over all of heaven and all of earth. Christ resides in the realm of dominion with the Father. He rules as Lord, and He will rescue us from this enslavement of douleia, of our thelese will. Again, powerful lesson, tremendous teaching. In our next lesson, we get to move into the very positive realm of sanctification.